This video introduces you to the basics of the new render setup system. The final result will enable you to create a render setup like this one. In this scene are a robot, a ground plane, an image plane, and an AI sky dome light to provide image-based lighting. The sky dome light simulates light from a dome above the scene and represents the sky in an outdoor scene. First, divide your scene into renderable layers. For example, in this scene, we want to render first the model and then its shadows. Therefore, we will create two layers. The background can then be added during compositing. To open the Render Setup editor, you can select the Rendering Standard workspace or the Rendering Expert workspace. Workspaces may appear different depending on the resolution of your monitor. You can also use the My Classic workspace and click this icon. Dock the Render Setup editor and Property editor as you like to create the layout best suited to your workflow. Click this icon to create a layer. Layers are populated via collections and contain the objects that you want to include in your render. The reason you add objects to collections and not directly to your layer is because collections enable you to create overrides for a set of objects. Right-click to create a collection. You can populate a collection by selecting nodes in the outliner or in the viewport and clicking Add. The panel on the right is called Property Editor. Properties for your layer, collections, and overrides are listed here. For example, to include all Trilobot nodes that you have selected in the outliner, click Add here. To ascertain that you have included the right nodes, click View All to display the list of collection members. This is most useful if you added a long list of nodes to your collection. Click the visibility icon to switch to the layer. The Trilobot group nodes have been added to the layer and are reflected in the viewport. Each layer has its visibility icon. To see the master layer, click its visibility icon. To return to the model layer, click on its visibility icon again. To render this model layer, you must disable the primary visibility of the ground plane. To do so, create an override on the primary visibility attribute of the ground plane. First, create a collection that contains the ground plane. Select the node in the outliner and click Add. Now create an override on the ground plane collection. You can create absolute or relative overrides. Absolute overrides allow you to set the exact value of an attribute. For example, to translate your objects to x equals 10, y equals 10, and z equals 10 exactly. Relative overrides allow you to modify your attribute relative to its current value. Relative overrides will be discussed later on in this video. To render the model layer without the ground plane, create an absolute override on the ground plane collection. Select Absolute from the drop-down list in the Property Editor, then middlemost drag and drop Primary Visibility from the Attribute Editor to the Property Editor. Because primary visibility is an attribute on the Shape node, a ground plane shapes collection is automatically created for you, as well as a corresponding override. Click View All to list the members of the collection. This collection contains the shape node of the ground plane collection. If you want to include additional geometry in your collection, add it to the ground plane collection. That is the parent collection. The parent collection determines membership, and a child collection should only contain a subset of the parent collection's members. An override has been created under the ground plane shapes collection. Select it and disable primary visibility in the Property Editor. You have now disabled the visibility of the ground plane in this layer. Here's a tip. When you drag an attribute to create an override, you're dragging the name of the attribute that is to be overridden, rather than the attribute that is specific to the node that you're dragging from. For example, in this case, you can select any shape node in your scene and drag and drop its primary visibility attribute. It does not have to be a shape node that is a member of your layer. Create an image plane collection to override its display mode so that it is hidden from the render. You can also populate a collection using an expression that encompasses the nodes that you want to include. Use a wildcard in your expression to include these nodes. This includes all nodes with names starting with image PL. An expression such as star ground star, for example, would include nodes such as city ground shader, or ground plane, or room ground. Namespaces are supported, and an expression such as chr:/span star would include all nodes in the chr namespace that begin with span. For example, chr:/span head, chr:/span body, and so forth. Verify your collection members by clicking View All. There are various ways to check the membership of your collection. You can click View All to list the nodes, or click Select All to select your members in the scene and in the outliner. There are also two separate select buttons. Use the top one to select the collection members you added using an expression. Use the bottom one if you populated your collection by statically adding nodes. You can create overrides using a second method. Set as visible the layer for which you want to create the override. Then select a collection and right-click the attribute in the attribute editor. When your scene changes, for example when you create an override, a red border may appear around the layer visibility icon to indicate that you need to refresh your active layer. Click this icon to update your layer accordingly. Similar to primary visibility, display mode is also an attribute on the shape node, and therefore an image plane shapes collection is automatically created for you, as well as the corresponding override. Select the override and set the display mode to none. The image plane no longer appears in the viewport and will be hidden in your render. An override can be disabled so that it does not apply but remains in the property editor. Render the layer to see the robot rendered without the image plane, ground plane, and IBL. Create a second layer to render the shadows. Because this is the shadow layer, the robot doesn't need to be included in the render, and you can override its primary visibility. Create a collection that contains the robot. Use the expression trilobot star to include the trilobot nodes. Drag and drop the primary visibility attribute from the attribute editor to the property editor. Select the override and disable the attribute. Create a material override on the ground plane and apply to it an AI shadow catcher shader. This allows the ground plane to capture the shadows in the scene. Create a ground plane collection. Then right-click the collection and select Create Material Override. And map to it an AI shadow catcher from the property editor. You can display the shader assigned to each object by enabling the Display Assigned Materials option in the outliner. Finally, to override the display mode on the image plane, create an image plane collection. And drag and drop the display mode attribute from the image plane attribute editor to the property editor. Select the override and set the display mode to none. Render the layer to see the shadows cast by the robot. You can now composite the renders of your two layers in your image plane using your favorite compositing software. Alternatively, you can also test your final render results by rendering the master layer. You should first apply an AI shadow catcher shader to your ground plane before test rendering. Make sure to enable transparency in the AI shadow catcher attribute editor. and disable Opaque in the R-Node section of the P-Plane Shape Attribute Editor. To go beyond this tutorial, you can create overrides to transform and rotate the robot. Relative overrides are created here to transform the robot relative to its current position. If you had more than one character in your scene, you can even create a collection that includes all of your characters and apply overrides to all of these characters simultaneously. Then you can create additional collections, one for each character, to apply character-specific overrides. Overrides allow you to apply non-destructive changes to your scene. You can easily revert your attributes back to their original state by disabling an override so that it does not apply. Enable and disable overrides to experiment with different settings. You can export these overrides in a template in the form of a JSON file and import them into another shot so you don't have to set them up again. Add a note to easily identify this file later on. Import your saved template from the Render Setup window. The note you added earlier appears as a tooltip as you mouse over the list of templates.